The morning Lord Westhaven came to present Cecily Vane with the terms of her ruin, he did not raise his voice. That was the first thing she noted about him. The voice, level and unhurried as a man reading aloud from a ledger, in which all the numbers already balanced. He set the document on the table between them without ceremony, aligned its edge with the table's edge as a man will do when he has considered beforehand exactly how much precision this moment requires, and he told her, quietly, in that second-floor anteroom of the council offices with the Thames grey and restless below the window, that she had two choices. She could sign the Vane estate over to Lord Clifton's trust, effective the end of the month, and the inquiry into her father's conduct would be closed without further proceedings. She would have the lease of Vane's townhouse for 3 more years, a modest annuity, and something that resembled, from a distance, a life. Or she could refuse, and the matter would go before a parliamentary committee, and her father's name, already buried under more suspicion than it could sustain, would be disinterred and tried properly, and the word treason would be spoken in rooms where men had actual authority over such designations. He said the word, without drama. Treason. As though it were merely the technical term for the thing that had happened, which, she supposed, in his world it was. She sat across from him with her hands folded on the locked document box she had placed in her lap when she arrived, and she looked at Lord Westhaven's face. 36 years old, strong-jawed, his dark hair silvering at the temples, with the particular distinction of a man who had spent years being important, and she said that she would take neither option. He looked at her then. Not the measured political survey he had offered her since she walked in. Something sharper, involuntary, as though she had said a thing that required a different response than the ones he had prepared. "There is no third option, Miss Vane," he said. "Then I will find one," she said, and the document box sat in her lap like a small sealed country she had not yet opened and would not open for him. She had known him only by his reputation before that morning. The Vane estate in Wiltshire, a modest property of 400 acres and a house in sufficient disrepair to count as character, had been her childhood and her father's pride, and the thing that had first appeared in the inquiry documents when her father died. Sir Edmund Vane had served the Foreign Office for 22 years, stationed twice in Vienna, once in Lisbon, once in the complicated years when Paris was uncertain territory and the men England sent there carried instructions in their memory rather than their dispatch cases. He had been a careful man, a meticulous one, a man who filed his reports in triplicate, and who, in Cecily's memory, had spent most of his evenings reading in the library with a glass of port, and a patience she had come to understand, as an adult, was the patience of a man who worried constantly about things he could not tell his daughter. He died of a fever in the autumn of Cecily's 23rd year, before the inquiry opened, which meant he could not defend himself against the claim that had surfaced 3 months after his burial. Correspondence had been found suggesting Sir Edmund had shared routing information for courier routes with a French contact in the last months of his service. The correspondence was not produced. The source of the claim was not named in the documents Cecily could obtain. What was produced was an affidavit, bearing the seal of the Earl of Westhaven's office, asserting that the matter had been referred to the Council's Review Committee. The estate had been frozen pending review. Cecily had been managing the sale of the library's secondary shelves to pay the household staff. She had not cried about it. She had not been able to afford the time. She had found the locked box in her father's study on the same afternoon. She discovered that the morning room's secondary curtains had been removed, by whom she could not establish, and she had carried it to her bedroom and looked at it for an hour before placing it in the bottom of her traveling trunk. Her father had left no key. He had left no note. He had left, pressed between the pages of his final household account book, a single folded sheet in his hand. It said, in his own careful hand, that if she was reading this, she should keep what was locked until she found someone fit to open it. She had not yet found anyone she trusted to be fit. She had not surrendered the box either. She heard through Mrs. Hatch, who heard through the solicitor's office runner, that Clifton had told his secretary not to anticipate difficulties. The Vane girl, he had said, had no money, no allies, and no recourse. The estate would be formalized by the end of the month. When Lord Westhaven arrived at Vane House 6 days after the anteroom meeting, she was told by her housekeeper, Mrs. Hatch, to conduct the inventory required before the estate transfer could be formalized. Cecily did not receive him in the drawing room. She received him in the library, because she was already there, and because the library was the room in Vane House. She could not bring herself to relinquish to the catalogers without being present. She did not hear him enter. She was on the library's second stepladder, pulling volumes from the upper shelves, checking each for her father's marginal notations before deciding whether to preserve it or release it to the sale catalog. The morning was cold, the fire insufficient to reach the higher reaches of the room, and she had put on her warmest dress, a plain dark gray wool that had been made for practicality rather than for receiving earls. She heard Mrs. Hatch's voice below, heard the response, low, level, that unhurried register she now recognized from the anteroom, and did not come down. She heard him cross the room. She heard him stop. He was standing at the bottom of the ladder when she looked down. He had his hands behind his back, and he was looking at the shelf she had half cleared. And his expression, for the first time since she had known of his existence, was not the controlled political surface she had catalogued. There was something else in it, a recognition, perhaps, of the specific gesture of a person dismantling a room they love. She descended the ladder with a volume under each arm and set them on the sorting table without acknowledging his expression. "I am keeping these," she said. "They are not listed in the estate assets. They were given to my father personally and are not part of the inventory." "I did not come to dispute the books," he said. "No," she said. "You came to dispute everything else." He was silent for a moment. His eyes moved to the empty upper shelves, to the careful stacks she had built on the sorting table, to the fire that was not quite warm enough, and then back to her. "You catalogued this yourself," he said. "My father's housekeeper is 61 and has a bad knee," Cecily said. "The catalogers Clifton sent worked for 2 hours before I dismissed them." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I found one of them pocketing a pocket almanac from the writing desk," she said. He did not comment. She watched his jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, in something more controlled than anger. A man registering a piece of information that had implications he would have preferred not to have. She set the volumes on the table with the particular care of someone for whom each one was a decision. He saw her pause over a natural history volume, open it to the frontispiece, and then check something in the margin with one finger before setting it in the keep pile. She did not look at him. She moved along the shelf with the systematic attention of someone who has been doing this in their head for weeks, before being able to do it in fact, and he stood below and watched and said nothing. She came down for the third time with an armful of papers, not books, folded in a manner that suggested she had been through them before. She sorted them without looking up. 3 letters she set aside with a precision that told him they were personal. 2 official-looking folded documents she set in a separate pile with the decisiveness of someone who has already decided what to do about them and is simply waiting for the moment. He saw her reach the row of her father's personal notebooks. She took one down, opened it to somewhere near the end, and stood there for nearly a full minute, reading. Her face was still, Her eyes moved. Then she closed the notebook and placed it in the keep pile with both hands, setting it down as one would set down something fragile. And then she straightened and looked at the shelf as though checking that everything was in the right order. She had not said a word the entire time. The library was quiet enough that he could hear the fire and the light wind against the windows. And faintly, her breathing steadying after the effort of the upper shelves. He stayed for 2 hours. He asked her twice whether she required anything, once when she was struggling with a box of papers that had been placed too high, and once when he observed that she had not eaten anything during the period he had been there. Both times she declined, and both times he did not argue. But the second time he told Mrs. Hatch, on his way through the hall, that the household coal delivery had apparently been interrupted and that he would send his man to resolve it. He said it to Mrs. Hatch, not to Cecily, and Cecily heard it from across the hall and told herself it was administration, not consideration, and did not examine the difference too carefully. There were moments, as the season pressed on, when Cecily found herself listening for his voice in rooms before she entered them. She did not permit herself to examine this. She had the box. She had the inquiry. She had the increasingly evident reality that Clifton was in a great hurry to have the estate formalized, and that his hurry had a shape she was beginning to read. He had arranged for Lady Ashmore, Nicholas Ashmore's mother, the Dowager Countess, to host a dinner at which Cecily was to appear as a guest, and, it became clear, to be made to feel the social weight of her own precariousness. She went, because refusing would have been read as admission. She wore the second best of her remaining good gowns, cream silk with the merest suggestion of the season's green, not enough to compete with the room, and not enough to look as though she were trying to disappear. And she sat at the table's far end and watched Lady Ashmore work. Lady Ashmore was a handsome woman in her mid-50s, with the particular posture of someone who had been decorative in youth, and had since learned that authority required no decoration. She had diamonds, a great many of them, and she deployed them with the precision of a woman who understood that jewels are a vocabulary. She addressed Cecily twice during the dinner, each time with a courtesy so exquisitely calibrated to remind you of your own smallness that it could not be challenged. At the table's end, a woman named Mrs. Fentworth, wife of the solicitor who had handled the estate freeze, leaned toward her neighbor and said, loudly enough to reach Cecily's end of the table, that the Vane girl had shown considerable backbone in holding out this long. The table registered the phrase, "the Vane girl," said with something between pity and the faint admiration one extends to a small animal persisting against a very large obstacle. Lady Ashmore heard it and smiled, the smile of a woman who has achieved an effect she did not need to engineer personally, and returned to her conversation with the gentleman to her right. Cecily looked at the salt cellar in the center of the table and said nothing, and her hands, which she had placed carefully in her lap beneath the tablecloth, were very still. He was across the table and 3 seats down. She did not look at him. She looked at the salt cellar and thought about the locked box, and thought about her father in his library reading his port and his patience, and did not look at Lord Westhaven until dinner was over, and the room had divided, and she found herself standing near the terrace doors alone, watching the garden go dark below. He appeared beside her, not quite at her shoulder, the width of propriety, which in a cold November garden was a width she could feel on her skin. "Lady Ashmore's dinners are efficient," he said. "Yes," Cecily said. "Everyone is made to understand their position within the first course." A pause. A fire burning in the grate behind them, the room's warmth and the garden's cold dividing precisely at the line of the glass. "Miss Vane," he said, "the affidavit from my office." She waited. The seal was genuine, he said. The authority behind it was not mine. She turned to look at him. His face was in profile, still watching the garden. His jaw was set in the manner she had come to understand was not coldness, but an effort at containment. The face of a man who has something that costs him to say, and is assembling it correctly before he says it. "Then whose?" she said. He did not answer immediately. Outside, the first ground frost was beginning to settle on the garden's stone path, barely visible in the lamplight from the house. "My brother Edmund served in Paris," he said. "In the same period as your father. He made a contact there that I did not know about until after your father's death." He paused. "He died before I could find out the extent of what he had done. He filed the referral to the council under my seal, using my name, in the last 2 months before he died. I found the documentation 3 weeks after your father's burial. By that point, the inquiry was already open." The fire behind her. The garden darkening. "You could have closed it," she said. "I could have closed it quietly," he said. "Which is different. The inquiry record would have remained sealed. The accusation would have been internalized, not exonerated. Your father would have died unclear." She looked at his face for a long moment. He was not looking at her. He was still watching the garden. "You did not close it quietly," she said. "No," he said. "Because you could not exonerate him without exposing Edmund." "Yes." She understood then the shape of the room she had been standing in since September. Not a trap set for her, a trap set for him, by Clifton, who had known about Edmund before Nicholas did, and had used that knowledge to keep Nicholas silent and his name complicit while Clifton moved on the estate. She also understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy, that the man standing 3 feet from her in the November dark had been carrying his brother's guilt through every single interaction they had had, and had told her none of it until now. She did not say either of these things. "My father left a box," she said, still looking at the garden. He turned to look at her then. "I know," he said. "You knew about the box?" "I knew he was careful," he said. "Careful men keep records." The fire behind her. The glass cold at her shoulder. The awareness of him beside her. The warmth of him in the cold November air. The specific and involuntary knowledge that his profile at 2 arms' lengths distance had become, in the week since his arrival in her library, a thing her body registered before her mind gave it permission. She had not expected this. She had expected Lord Westhaven to be the shape of a threat, which is what he had been on paper, and the shape of a man doing the minimum required of him, which is what he had seemed at first. She had not expected the coal sent without announcement. She had not expected the quiet understanding of why the library's books mattered, the way he had stood at the bottom of the ladder and known without being told that what she was doing was not inventory. She had not expected him to tell her about his brother in the dark of a garden when he owed her nothing but an administrative process. The trouble with the body, she had come to understand, was that it did not distinguish between what was useful and what was true. Her hands at her sides were very still, and the pulse at her throat was not. "If you want me to open it," she said, "tell me who holds the council's inquiry secretary." "Not Clifton. Not anyone Clifton has access to." He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was long enough. "Sir Percival Holt," he said, "the first secretary. He is not Clifton's." "Then I want to see him," she said. "With the box, before the end of the week." She turned from the window and crossed the room, and she did not look back at him, because she already knew that if she looked back at him, she would see something in his face that she was not yet able to afford the weight of. If there are moments when you wonder what it means to refuse the terms a man of consequence presents you, stop here and hold that question. Because what Cecily Vane did next is what this story is actually about. 3 days later, Clifton produced a second affidavit. This one named a witness, a retired postal clerk named Dobson, who claimed to have seen Sir Edmund Vane hand a sealed envelope to a man of French description at a London address in the spring of his last year of service. Dobson was 72 years old and had bad eyes, and the affidavit's phrasing was so tidily done that it answered the previous gaps in the inquiry with suspicious precision. Clifton presented it in a private session with 2 council members, neither of whom was Sir Percival Holt. He did not invite Cecily. He circulated a note to Lord Westhaven's office informing him that given the new testimony, a formal parliamentary proceeding was now likely, and that it would be in all parties' interests to conclude the estate matter before the proceeding could begin. Cecily heard of it from Mrs. Hatch, who heard of it from the housemaid of a council clerk's wife, which was how most things of importance were heard in London if you were a woman without a seat at the table. She sat in the library with the news and the locked box and the fire and the specific weight of having believed, for the span of 4 days, that she had an ally. She had heard nothing from Lord Westhaven since Lady Ashmore's dinner. His office had sent a formal acknowledgment of the inventory's completion in the handwriting of a secretary, with no additional note. He had said he would not close the inquiry quietly. He had not, to her knowledge, closed it at all. And now Clifton had moved, and he had said nothing. In the passage outside the library, she heard the third-floor housemaid, Agnes, telling the hallboy that it was a shame. Really, the Vane girl had held on longer than anyone expected. But there it was. The Vane girl. The hallboy said nothing in response. The housemaid moved on. The fire shifted. She placed both hands on the locked box and held it for a long moment. Her father had said to wait for someone fit to open it. She had waited. She had looked for fitness in a man who had stood in her library and noticed her careful stacks, who had sent coal without making a performance of it, who had told her the truth about his brother in the dark of a garden when he had no obligation to tell her anything. Fit, she thought, was not the same as present. And waiting was not the same as trusting. She picked up the box and went to find her coat. She presented herself at Sir Percival Holt's private office at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, without an appointment. His secretary told her Sir Percival was not available. She sat in the waiting room with the locked box in her lap, and told the secretary, with considerable courtesy, that she would remain until he was. She waited 2 hours. She read the same 2 pages of the book she had brought 7 times and did not retain them. She watched the other waiting visitors come and go, and thought about her father reading his port in the library, and thought about the morning room curtains that had disappeared, and thought about his profile in the November garden. Sir Percival Holt received her at 6 o'clock, 40 minutes before the office closed. He was a small, tidy man in his late 60s, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms where what was not said mattered as much as what was. He looked at her, and at the box, with equal attention. She laid the case for her father's exoneration in 11 minutes. She had rehearsed it until it ran clean of emotion, without being clean of urgency. She laid out the inquiry's timeline, the affidavit's sealed origins, the second affidavit's suspicious precision. She did not name Edmund Ashmore directly, because to name him directly was to name Nicholas, and she found, sitting across from Sir Percival Holt, that she was not willing to do that without Nicholas present to answer for himself. She said only that she had reason to believe the source of the original accusation was a party with a personal interest in the estate transfer, and that the locked box her father had left her might constitute material evidence in the inquiry's proper resolution. Sir Percival looked at the box. "You have not opened it," he said. "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about this for a moment. Because whatever is in it deserves to be opened in front of someone who can do something with what they find, she said. Not in my bedroom, where it proves nothing. He was quiet. She held the box in her lap with both hands, and the fire in his office was warmer than the library's had been for weeks, and she was tired in a way that went past the body into the specific fatigue of people who have been careful for a very long time. Leave it with me, Sir Percival said. Come back on Thursday with any additional documentation you have. And Miss Vane, is there anyone who can speak to the second affidavit's witness? Who would know Dobson's record? Lord Westhaven might, she said very carefully. If he chooses to. Sir Percival looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. Lord Westhaven, he said, requested a private meeting with my office 4 days ago. He was told I was unavailable. He sent a written communication instead. He glanced at his desk. I have not yet replied. She looked at the document box in his hands. Her father's box, no longer locked away in her trunk, now on a desk where it belonged. And she thought that this was the third path. The anteroom of the council offices was familiar to her by now. She had sat in it twice before this, once for the initial inquiry notification, once for the meeting where Lord Westhaven had presented the binary. She knew the quality of its light, the way the Thames beyond the window went from gray to silver in the late afternoon, the uncomfortable excellence of its chairs. Thursday arrived with a cold east wind and the first serious frost of the season, and she sat in the anteroom and waited again. He arrived 8 minutes after her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular quiet authority of his footfall, the low exchange with the secretary at the door, and she looked up to find him already looking at her. He had stopped 3 feet inside the door, and his face was doing the thing she had last seen in the November garden. It was the careful assembly of a man for whom the usual controls were not quite adequate to the moment. You went to Holt, he said. Yes, she said. He crossed the room and took the chair 2 seats from hers. Not beside her. 2 seats. Which in the particular vocabulary of that room was close enough to be deliberate. She was aware of him in the particular way she had been aware of him since the library in October. Not as a constant thought, but as a constant fact. The way a person is aware of the quality of the air changing before rain. She had learned the sound of his footfall in corridors. She had noticed, without meaning to, that he always checked a window on entering a room, a habit of a man who needs to know how many ways out are available. She had observed, at Lady Ashmore's dinner, that he had not eaten much either, and that he had watched the room with the patient attention of someone waiting for a particular thing to be said. She had told herself, with some regularity, that she was cataloging him the way she cataloged everything, because knowledge was the only reliable resource left to her. She was not certain she believed this. I sent a written communication, he said. I know, she said. He told me. A pause. The east wind against the window, the Thames silver below. The box, he said. Is with Sir Percival, she said. As of Monday. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hands, resting on his knees, perfectly still. The hands of a man who does not move unless movement is required, and thought about how many rooms she had stood in since September, and how many of them he had been in too, at a careful distance, being adequate to the situation. I should have come to you directly, he said. After the second affidavit. Yes, she said. You should have. He did not argue with this. He said, after a moment, that he had been trying to determine whether his presence at this stage constituted a conflict. You were, she said, trying to determine whether helping me would expose you. Another pause. Longer. Both things, he said. She looked at him. His profile, which she knew by now as well as any face she had known as a child, was turned toward the window, and the afternoon light on it was severe and exact, and showed her everything she had been refusing to look at directly for 2 months. It was the face of a man in genuine difficulty, not with her, but with himself. "Nicholas," she said. He turned to look at her. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. It arrived. "Whatever is in the box," she said, "will either exonerate my father, or it will not. If it does not, I will still not sign the estate over to Clifton, and you will still have to decide what you do about Edmund. Those are the facts. I am not asking you to resolve them for me." She paused. "But I am asking you to be in the room." He held her gaze for a long moment. She was aware of the fire behind her, the warmth of it at her back. She was aware of him 2 seats away, the particular quality of his stillness, the way her own breathing had steadied and deepened without her choosing it. "Yes," he said. "I will be in the room." Sir Percival Holt's session opened at 3 o'clock with 4 men in attendance. The first secretary himself, a council notation clerk, Lord Clifton, who had arrived already certain of his ground, already arranging himself in his chair with the ease of a man watching a formality he expects to conclude in his favor, and Lord Westhaven, whose arrival had clearly not been part of Clifton's calculation. Cecily was permitted to attend as the petitioning party. She sat to one side, the document box now on the table before Sir Percival, and she waited. The box was opened by Sir Percival with a tool brought by the clerk. It was not dramatic. The mechanism gave way with a soft sound, and Sir Percival lifted the lid and looked inside, and was quiet for a moment. What the box contained was not a single explosive document. It contained 41 letters, filed in her father's careful hand, covering the period from the spring of his Paris posting to the autumn before his death. The letters were to a Foreign Office contact named Cowley, who had died in 1809, but a significant number were not letters at all. They were receipts. Routing receipts for courier packages handled through the Paris office, with her father's signature on one side and the receiving officer's on the other. On 9 of those receipts, the receiving officer's signature was Edmund's. The pattern was clear to Sir Percival within 4 minutes. He called the clerk to note specific dates. Clifton was sitting very still. "The contact used to pass routing information," Sir Percival said, "appears to have been Edmund Ashmore, not Sir Edmund Vane." He looked at Lord Westhaven. "Who received the routing packages?" The room was very quiet. Clifton began to speak. Something measured, prepared, about the reliability of old receipts, about the difficulty of reconstructing, and Lord Westhaven said, in a voice that was entirely level and carried no inflection of triumph at all, "Miss Vane's father was innocent. My brother was not." The weight of those 10 words in that room fell like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward in the silence that followed. Clifton's hands moved to the chair's arm and then stilled. His face underwent a careful adjustment, the face of a man who has just watched the particular ground he was standing on dissolve, and who is deciding at speed whether there is other ground available. There was not. Sir Percival had the box, and the receipts, and the clerk's notation, and the structure of what had happened, Edmund's contact, Clifton's subsequent leverage of that knowledge, the false affidavit filed under Nicholas's seal, the pressure applied to a dead man's daughter, was becoming visible in the room in real time, assembled from documents rather than from accusation. Clifton looked at Lord Westhaven. "You would destroy your family's name for this," he said. "My family's name," Lord Westhaven said, "is already carrying a weight it does not deserve." This ends it." He looked at Sir Percival. "I have additional documentation in my office. I will deliver it by tomorrow morning." Clifton was silent after that. Sir Percival asked 3 more questions, noted the clerk's entries, and closed the session with the statement that the inquiry into Sir Edmund Vane's conduct would be suspended pending full review, and that the estate freeze order would be lifted within the week. Cecily sat very still through all of it. She did not cry. She did not speak. She held her hands folded in her lap and looked at the receipts arranged on Sir Percival's table, and thought about her father in his library, drinking his port, carrying his patients through 22 years of careful service, and she let the afternoon light from the window be adequate to the moment. When the session ended and the room cleared, she found herself in the corridor with him. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Holt will need a formal reply to the estate freeze notice within 3 days. I can arrange—" "Nicholas?" she said. He stopped. "In a moment I will think about all of that. Right now I'm thinking about my father, and I would like you to permit me 1 minute to do that." He was quiet. They stood in the council corridor with the east wind light fading at the far end of it, and the session's documents still being carried past them by the clerk in careful stacks, and he did not say anything, and she was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for a warmth you did not know you needed until you felt it settle. The estate freeze was lifted 10 days later. Clifton withdrew from the council's social calendar without announcement, and no announcement was needed. Lady Ashmore sent Cecily a note that was the precise shape of an apology from someone who has never been required to apologize directly, and Cecily read it once and set it down and did not read it again. The Wiltshire estate required work. The townhouse required fewer repairs. Mrs. Hatch returned to her full household position with a raise Cecily could now afford, and the housemaid Agnes was moved to a better room, which Agnes received with the particular combination of surprise and dignity that belongs to people who have been undervalued for a long time. Cecily went home to the Wiltshire house in January. She went home in the particular way of someone who has been away long enough that return requires readjustment. The familiar rooms slightly strange. The proportions of the place both smaller and more generous than memory had kept them. She walked through the library first, as she always did, and found it more or less as she had left it. The estate's catalogers had not progressed beyond the front shelves before she had dismissed them, and the secondary shelves that she had been selling were still there, not yet touched. She walked to the upper row of shelves and put back the books she had carried with her. One by one, in their proper order, returned to their proper places, her father's penciled notes in the margins, his system, which only she and he had ever understood. The pressed letter she had found in the autumn, still folded inside its book, which she placed back on the shelf and did not remove. She was still there, on the stepladder, when Nicholas Ashmore arrived. He had written ahead, a brief, formal note asking if she would receive him. She had sent a brief, formal reply saying yes. This was what they had both been doing in the weeks since the council session, communicating at the level of formality that 2 careful people maintain when they are each waiting to see if the other will say something that cannot be undone. He came into the library, as he had come into it in the autumn, and stood at the bottom of the ladder, and looked up at her. She came down. "The shelves look better with the books in them," he said. "Yes," she said. She set the last volume on the sorting table and looked at him. The Wiltshire light was different from London's, softer, wider, with the particular quality of January afternoons in the English countryside that feel both early and suspended, as though the day is deciding whether to commit to itself. He had his coat still on. He had not yet decided whether he was staying. "I owe you," he said, "a more complete account of my brother, and of what I knew and when I knew it. There are things I should have told you earlier, and I did not tell them for reasons that made sense to me at the time and do not satisfy me now." "All right," she said. "And there are other things," he said, "that I have not said, because I was not certain I had the standing to say them, which may also prove to be the case." He paused. "But I would prefer to say them anyway, and let you be the one to judge the standing." She looked at him, his face in the Wiltshire light, the silver at his temples, the jaw she had catalogued through months of anteroom meetings and dinner tables and November gardens, and thought about the moment she had said his name in the council waiting room and watched it reach him. "You may stay," she said, "if you like." She turned and placed the last book on the shelf with both hands, settling it into its proper place, and heard him take off his coat. Outside the library windows, the Wiltshire fields were beginning to blue at the edges, the early evening coming in from the east. She had been away from this house for 4 months. She had spent those months in anteroom waiting chairs and council corridors and dinner tables where she was the anomaly, the piece that did not fit the pattern, the woman who would not perform the compliance that would have made everyone comfortable. She had held the locked box, and she had not surrendered it, and now her father's name was clean, and the house was hers, and the fire was lit, and the man who had stood at the bottom of her ladder in October was standing in her library in January, and she had told him he could stay. It was, she thought, a better kind of warmth than the fire. The fire was lit before evening, and the Wiltshire library was warm for the first time since autumn, and the document box sat on her father's desk with its lid open, empty now, its purpose served, its patience finally at its end. Snow came after dark, soft and particular, settling on the stone of the house and the bare fields beyond, and the room was quiet, and the books were back where they belonged, and the light on the desk was a single candle burning toward morning. If you stayed until the end, leave a word for Cecily's father, the careful man who trusted his daughter to find the right moment. And whenever you need it, this story is here.